The Swedish Empire refers to the Kingdom of Sweden's territorial control of much of the Baltic region during the 17th and early 18th centuries, a time when Sweden was one of the great European powers. The beginning of the empire is usually taken as the reign of Gustavus Adolphus, who ascended the throne in 1611, and the end as the loss of territories in 1721 following the Great Northern War. In Swedish history, the period is referred to as Stormaktstiden, literally meaning the Great Power Era. After the death of Gustavus Adolphus in 1632, the empire was, over lengthy periods, controlled by part of the high nobility, most prominently the Oxenstierna family, acting as tutors for minor regents. The interests of the high nobility contrasted with the uniformity policy, i.e., the upholding of the traditional equality and status of the Swedish estates favored by the kings and peasantry. In territories acquired during the periods of de facto noble rule, serfdom was not abolished, and there was also a trend to set up respective estates in Sweden proper. The Great Reduction of 1680 put an end to these efforts of the nobility and required them to return estates once gained from the crown to the king. Serfdom, however, remained in force in the dominions acquired in the Holy Roman Empire and in Swedish Estonia, where a consequent application of the uniformity policy was hindered by the treaties by which they were gained. After the victories in the 30 Years' War, the climax of the Great Power Era was reached during the Second Northern War, when the primary adversary Denmark was neutralized by the Treaty of Roskilde in 1658. However, in the further course of this war as well as in the subsequent Scanian War, Sweden was able to maintain her empire only with support of her closest ally, France. Charles XI of Sweden consolidated the empire and ensured a period of peace before Russia, Saxony and Denmark started a concerted attack on his successor, Charles XII. After initial Swedish victories, Charles secured the empire for some time in the Peace of Travendel and the Treaty of Altrandstadt, before the Battle of Poltava finally brought the Great Power Era of Sweden to an end. Dominions. As a result of 18 years of war, Sweden gained small and scattered possessions, but had secured control of three principal rivers in northern Germany, the Oder, the Elbe and the Weser, and gained toll collection rights for those important commercial arteries. Two principal reasons for the small reparations were France's envy and Queen Christina's impatience. As a result of Sweden's intervention, Sweden helped secure religious liberty in Europe for Protestants, becoming a leading power of continental Protestantism for 90 years. The elevation of Sweden to the rank of an imperial power required that it remain a military monarchy, armed for possible emergency. Sweden's poverty and sparse population meant the country was ill-suited for imperial status. However, in the middle of the 17th century, with France as a firm ally, the incompatibility between its powers and its pretensions was not so obvious. Domestic consolidation. For the moment, Sweden held a tenuous position of leadership. Careful statesmanship might mean permanent dominion on the Baltic shore, but left little room for mistakes. Unfortunately, the extravagance of Gustavus Adolphus's two immediate successors, Christina and Charles X Gustav, caused great difficulties for the new empire. Christina's financial extravagance brought the state to the verge of bankruptcy, and the financial difficulties caused public unrest before her abdication. The Swedish people feared that the external, artificial greatness of their country might be purchased with the loss of their civil and political liberties. The Swedish people looked to a new king to address the problem of too much power vested in the nobility. Charles X Gustav was a strong arbiter between the people and the nobility. Primarily a soldier, he directed his ambition towards military glory, but he was also an unusually sharp-sighted politician. While placing great emphasis on military strength, he also understood that domestic unity was necessary for a powerful foreign policy. The most pressing domestic question was the reduction, or restitution, of alienated crown lands. At the Riksdag of the Estates of 1655, the king proposed that noble holders of crown property should either 1. Pay an annual sum of 200,000 riksdaler out of the lands they would receive, or 2. Surrender a fourth of the property itself, worth approximately 800,000 riksdaler. The nobility wished to avoid taxation and stipulated that November 6, 1632, the day of Gustavus Adolphus's death, should be the limit to which retrospective taxes could be collected, and that there should be no further restitution of alienated crown property. Against this, the overtaxed lower estates protested, and the Diet had to be suspended. The king intervened, not to quell the commons, as the Senate insisted, but to compel the nobility to give way. He proposed a special committee to investigate the matter before the meeting of the next Riksdag, and that a proportional contribution should be levied on all classes in the meantime. Both groups accepted this arrangement. Charles X Gustav had done his best to recover from the financial extravagance of Christina. However, his own desire for military glory may have caused problems for his country. In 3 days, he persuaded the Swedish estates of the potential of his attack on Poland. However, when he left Stockholm for Warsaw on July 10, 1654, he gained more personal glory than advantage for his country. The Polish War expanded into a general European war. He achieved passage over the belts and emerged triumphant, only to die of sheer exhaustion. Immediately after his death, a regency was appointed to govern Sweden during the minority of his only son and successor, Charles XI of Sweden, who was 4 years old. The Regency Council moved quickly to end the war with Sweden's numerous enemies, which now included the Tsardom of Russia, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Electorate of Brandenburg and Denmark-Norway. The Peace of Oliva. The Peace of Oliva on May 3, 1660, put an end to the long feud with Poland. During the wars, Poland lost an estimated 1/3 of its population and its status as a great power. French mediation of this treaty also ended the quarrel between Sweden and the Emperor and the Elector of Brandenburg. This treaty confirmed both Sweden's possession of Livonia and the Elector of Brandenburg's sovereignty over Prussia, and the King of Poland renounced all claim to the Swedish crown. The treaty compelled Denmark-Norway to reopen direct negotiations with Sweden. Eventually, under the Treaty of Copenhagen on May 27, 1660, Sweden kept the 3 formerly Danish Scandinavian provinces and the formerly Norwegian Bohuslän province, which Denmark-Norway had surrendered by the Treaty of Roskilde 2 years previously, but Sweden had to relinquish the Norwegian province of Trøndelag, and the Danish island of Bornholm, which had been surrendered at Roskilde. Denmark-Norway was also compelled to recognize the independence of the Dukes of Holstein-Gottorp. The Russo-Swedish War was terminated by the Treaty of Cardiff on July 2, 1661, through which the Tsar surrendered the Baltic provinces to Sweden, Ingria, Estonia and Kexholm. Thus, Sweden emerged from the war not only a military power, but also one of the largest states of Europe, possessing more than twice as much territory as modern Sweden. The land area of Sweden was 1,100,000 square kilometers. While modern Sweden is bounded by the Baltic, during the 17th century the Baltic formed a bond between various widely dispersed dominions. All the islands in the Baltic, except the Danish group, belonged to Sweden. Stockholm, the capital, lay in the very center of the empire, whose second greatest city was Riga, on the other side of the sea. This empire contained less than 1/3 of the population of modern Sweden, at only 2,500,000 people, or about 2.3 people per square kilometer. However, Sweden's expansion had been possible partly due to turmoil and weakness in countries in its vicinity, and when they became more stable, they began to look for chances to regain what was lost. Danish defeat. Sweden had now won considerable political influence, which was lessened by the loss of moral prestige. On Charles X Gustav's accession in 1655, Sweden's neighbours may have become allies. However, territorial loss combined with the loss of religious liberty lessened their ties to Sweden. At Charles X Gustav's death 5 years later, Sweden had not only damaged its newly claimed territories but also had become hated by the surrounding states for its lack of defensive Protestantism. Charles X Gustav's attempt to gain the favour of Brandenburg by dividing Poland not only reversed his original policy, but also created a new southern rival almost as dangerous as Denmark in the west. In 1660, after 5 years of warfare, Sweden had obtained peace and the opportunity to organize and develop the new vast realm. Unfortunately, the 15-year regency that followed Charles X Gustav was unable to maneuver through the situation it faced. The administration was internally divided and hindered by the lack of unity and talent among its statesmen. The two major rivals were the military aristocratic party headed by Magnus de la Gardie and the Party of Peace and Economy led by Johan Gyllenstierna. The aristocratic group prevailed and brought with it a decline of morality which made it notorious to its neighbours. The administration was noted for sloth and carelessness, leading to a general neglect of business. Additionally, government corruption led Sweden to be hired by foreign powers. This subsidy policy dates from the Treaty of Fontainebleau of 1661, through which Sweden, in exchange for a considerable sum of money, supported the French candidate for the Polish throne. Sweden was torn between Louis XIV of France and his adversaries in plans to control the Spanish Netherlands. The anti-French faction prevailed, and in April 1668, Sweden acceded to the Triple Alliance, which ended the French acquisitions through the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. For the next 4 years, Sweden remained true to the Triple Alliance, but, in 1672, Louis XIV succeeded in isolating the Dutch Republic and regaining Sweden as an ally. By the Treaty of Stockholm on April 14, 1672, Sweden entered an agreement with the French to protect its sphere of interest containing the Dutch Republic from hostile German claims in return for 400,000 riksdaler per annum in peace and 600,000 in wartime. The Scanian War. In 1674, Louis XIV called upon Sweden to invade the electorate of Brandenburg. In May 1675, a Swedish army advanced into the Mark but, on June 18, was defeated at Fäbolin, and retreated to Swedish Demmin. The Fäbolin affair was a mere skirmish, with actual casualties amounting to fewer than 600 men. But it made Sweden appear vulnerable and enabled neighboring countries to attack in the Scanian War. At this point, the empire began to crumble. In 1675, Swedish Pomerania and the Duchy of Bremen were taken by the Brandenburgers, Austrians, and Danes. In December 1677, the Elector of Brandenburg captured Stettin. Stralsund fell on October 15, 1678. Greifswald, Sweden's last possession on the continent, was lost on November 5. A defensive alliance with John III of Poland was rendered inoperative on August 4, 1677, by the annihilation of Sweden's sea power, the Battle of Öland, June 17, 1676, the Battle of Fehmarn, June 1677, and most notable on July 1, July 2, the Battle of Kodja Bay. The difficulties concerning the Polish king continued. Through homeland military successes of the young Swedish king and the diplomatic activity of Louis XIV, a peace congress began its sessions at Nijmegen in March 1677, and in the beginning of April 1678, the French king dictated the terms of a peace. One of his chief conditions was the complete restitution of Sweden, as he needed a strong Swedish ally. However, Charles XI refused to go along with ceding territories to its enemies, which led the French king to negotiate on behalf of Sweden without its consent. By the treaties of Nijmegen on February 7 and of Saint-Germain on June 29, 1679, Sweden received almost full restitution of its German territory. By the Peace of Fontainebleau confirmed by the subsequent Peace of Lund on September 2, Denmark was to return all the land it had captured to Sweden on October 4, 1679. While Sweden could never have gained these concessions alone, Charles XI formed a personal dislike of the French king and developed a strong anti-French bias. Charles XI. The remainder of the reign of Charles XI is remarkable for a revolution, in which the government of Sweden was transformed to a semi-absolute monarchy. The king emerged from the war convinced that if Sweden were to retain its position as a great power, it needed to reform its whole economic system radically and circumscribe the power of the aristocracy. Charles XI felt that he could do it now that he had allies in the lower orders to support him. The Riksdag of Stockholm, October 1680, began a new era of Swedish history. On the motion of the estate of peasants, the question of the recovery of the alienated crown lands was brought before the Riksdag, and a resolution of the Diet directed that all countships, baronies, domains, manors and other estates producing an annual rent of more than a certain amount per annum should revert to the crown. The same Riksdag decided that the king was not bound by any particular constitution, but only by law and statutes, and not even obligated to consult the Privy Council, but was to be regarded as a sovereign lord. The Privy Council changed its official title from Riksråd to Kungligt Råd, a visible sign that the councillors were no longer the king's colleagues, but rather his servants. Thus, Sweden had become an absolute monarchy, but enacted the right of the Swedish people, in parliament, to be consulted on all important matters. The Riksdag, completely overshadowed by the crown, did little more than register the royal decrees during the reign of Charles XI of Sweden, but it continued to exist as an essential part of the government. Moreover, this transfer of authority was a voluntary act. The people, knowing the king to be their ally, trusted and cooperated with him. The Riksdag of 1682 declared that the king was empowered to bestow fiefs and take them back again, making the king the disposer of his subjects' temporal property. Presently, this new principle of autocracy was extended to the king's legislative authority, when on December 9, 1682, all four estates not only confirmed that the king held the legislative powers enjoyed by his predecessors, but even gave him the right of interpreting and amending the common law. The recovery of the alienated crown lands occupied Charles XI for the rest of his life. He created a commission, which was ultimately converted into a permanent Department of State. It acted on the principle that the titles of all private landed estates might be called in question, because at some time or other they must have belonged to the crown, and the burden of proof of ownership lay with the actual owner of the property, not the crown. The amount of revenue accruing to the crown from the whole reduction is impossible to estimate, but by these means, combined with careful management and rigid economy, Charles XI reduced the national debt by 3/4. Charles XI re-established on a broader basis the reorganization of the indelningsverk, a system of military tenure in which national forces were bound to the soil. This tied to the rusthail tenure, under which the tenants, instead of paying rent, were obliged to equip and maintain a cavalry soldier and horse, while the Netherlands supplied duly equipped foot soldiers. Soldiers were provided with holdings on which they lived in times of peace. Formerly, ordinary conscription had existed alongside this indelning, or distribution system, but it had proved inadequate as well as highly unpopular, and in 1682, Charles XI ended it in favor of an extended distribution system. The Swedish Royal Navy was entirely remodeled, and, the recent war having demonstrated the unsuitability of Stockholm as a naval station, the construction of a new arsenal was begun at Karlskrona. After 17 years of financial difficulties, the twofold enterprise was completed. At the death of Charles XI, Sweden could boast of a fleet of 43 three-deckers, manned by 11,000 men and armed with 2,648 guns, and one of the finest arsenals in the world. Charles XII and the Great Northern War. After Charles XI's death, the throne was inherited by his underage son, Charles XII. After a brief regency, he was declared to be of age to rule. 3 years later, in 1700, Denmark, Poland and Russia, the countries that had lost the most territory to Sweden, jointly declared war. Denmark was soon forced to peace after a joint intervention of Swedish, English and Dutch armies, whereafter the king and much of the Swedish army were shipped to the Baltic provinces, where Russian and Polish armies were laying siege to several towns. The Russian army was soundly defeated in the Battle of Narva, after which Charles took the army into Poland with the intent of dethroning the Polish king Augustus II. This took several years, but in 1706, with the Treaty of Altenstadt, he reached his goal. In the meantime, Russia had managed to take possession of several towns by the Baltic Sea. Instead of trying to retake these, Charles chose to march directly on Moscow, but due to extreme weather, difficulties with his supply lines and the Russian scorched earth strategy, he was forced to turn towards Ukraine. In 1709, the Swedish army was defeated and captured in the Battle of Poltava. Charles managed to escape south to Bender in the Ottoman Empire. Following the defeat at Poltava, Poland and Denmark re-entered the war, along with other countries wanting parts of the Swedish provinces. In the following years, most of them would fall, and Russia occupied the eastern half of Sweden. Despite these setbacks, Charles XII twice tried to invade Norway to force Denmark-Norway out of the war again. On November 30, 1718, King Charles XII fell during the siege of Fredriksson Fortress in Fredrikshald, today's Halden. With his death, Swedish war efforts mostly came to a halt. Although Russia continued to harass the civilian population of the Swedish coastal areas until the concluding Treaty of Nystad was finally signed in 1721. Sweden would remain a regional power of varying success until the 19th century. But the Great Northern War put an end to Sweden's time as a great power.